Who are you?
Hello, my fear seekers. I'm your fear master. Has your neighbor ever knocked on your door at midnight? Have you ever wondered what dark secrets your neighbors might be hiding? That friendly smile as they pass by, that hand waving from across the street. What if behind that friendly facade lay the most disturbing secrets? Tonight, we are going to explore the mystery and horror that might be lurking in the house next door. Get ready to discover neighbors who are not what they seem, houses with sinister mysteries, and the inexplicable lurking in every corner. Remember, sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones living right next door. So, before you ask your neighbor for a cup of sugar, make sure it's not laced with arsenic. Let's begin. The Creepy Neighbor. My name is Laura, and this is the story of how my neighbor turned into my worst nightmare. It all began when I moved into a new apartment in a small town. I was excited to start a new chapter in my life, but I had no idea what lay ahead. My next-door neighbor, Carlos, was a middle-aged man who lived alone. At first, he seemed a bit odd, but harmless. He always greeted me with a nervous smile, and I often saw him sitting on his porch, staring into the distance. I didn't think much of him until things started to get strange. One day, I came home from work and noticed that my door was slightly ajar. I entered cautiously, thinking I might have forgotten to close it, but my intuition told me something was wrong. I quickly inspected the apartment, and although nothing seemed to be missing, I had the feeling that someone had been there. I decided to install a security camera in the living room, just to be safe. For the next few nights, everything seemed normal until one morning when I reviewed the footage. To my horror, I saw Carlos entering my apartment in the middle of the night. He wandered around the living room, inspecting my belongings, and then sat on my couch, staring fixedly at my bedroom door. Fear paralyzed me. I didn't know what to do. I called the police and showed them the video. They arrived quickly and arrested Carlos. He denied everything, but the footage was clear. Carlos was released on bail but had a restraining order prohibiting him from approaching me or my apartment. From that moment on, I started noticing strange things in my apartment. Objects moved out of place, windows opened that I had closed, and the constant feeling of being watched. Every time I saw Carlos from a distance, he gave me a creepy smile that sent shivers down my spine. One night, while trying to sleep, I heard a noise in the kitchen. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone to call the police, but before I could dial, my bedroom door slowly opened. There stood Carlos, his expression disturbing. "What are you doing here?" I screamed, my voice trembling with fear. "You shouldn't leave your door open," he murmured, stepping toward me. I screamed with all my might, and fortunately, my neighbors heard and called the police. Carlos tried to flee, but the officers arrived in time and arrested him. I discovered that Carlos had been entering my apartment using a master key he had somehow obtained. He was charged with breaking and entering and stalking, and eventually, he was sentenced to prison. Even though Carlos was no longer around, the experience left me traumatized. I changed all the locks and reinforced the security in my apartment. However, the fear and paranoia persisted for a long time. I learned to be more cautious and aware of my surroundings. Months before discovering the recordings, Carlos and I had normal, neighborly interactions. He helped me with a few things in my apartment, like changing a light bulb and carrying a heavy box. I always thought he was just being kind, though a bit reserved. I never thought this would lead to him developing an obsession with me. Shortly after the incident with the ajar door, I noticed my pets, a cat and a dog, began acting strangely. My cat, normally independent, hid under the bed, and my dog barked towards the front door, especially at night. Initially, I thought they were reacting to a stray animal, but now I know they were probably sensing Carlos's presence. I decided to enhance my security by installing an additional lock and making sure all windows were closed. But the night Carlos broke into my bedroom, I realized that no matter how many locks I installed, he had a master key. After Carlos's arrest, the police searched his apartment. They found a disturbing shrine with photos of me and personal items that had gone missing from my apartment. There were journals filled with notes about my daily routines, my likes and dislikes, and even conversations I had had on the phone. It was evident that Carlos had been spying on me for months, gathering information about me. During the trial, I learned that Carlos had developed an obsession with me from the day I moved in. He used to spy through his windows and followed my every move. Forensic psychologists described him as someone with an obsessive and delusional personality. Hearing these details made me feel even more vulnerable and exposed. Over time, I tried to rebuild my life. I joined a support group for stalking victims and found solace in sharing my experience with others who had gone through similar situations. However, the trauma affected me deeply. Night sounds kept me awake, and any creak or whisper filled me with panic. I decided to move to another city, far from where everything had happened. I found a new apartment in a nice neighborhood and made sure it had extra security measures. I also bought an alarm system and maintained close contact with my new neighbors, making sure we were all aware of any suspicious activity. My experience with Carlos taught me the importance of trusting my instincts. The warning signs were there from the beginning, but I ignored them, thinking I was just being paranoid. Now I know it's better to be safe than sorry. Even though the fear and paranoia still accompany me, I've found ways to deal with them. Therapy has helped me process the trauma and regain a sense of normalcy. Although I'll never forget what happened, I'm learning to live without letting fear control my life. As time passed, I discovered that my story had impacted others in the community. Some of my former neighbors banded together to create a neighborhood watch program, and local authorities began taking reports of harassment and suspicious behavior more seriously. My experience served as a reminder that we must all be vigilant and look out for one another. Now, years later, I can look back and see how much I've grown and learned from that experience. I still have moments of anxiety, but I'm no longer the scared person I once was. I've become an advocate for personal safety and well-being, sharing my story to help others recognize the signs of danger and act before it's too late. Carlos's story and my experience with him are a testament to the power of human resilience. Although it was a dark time in my life, I have emerged stronger and wiser, ready to face any challenge that comes my way. And although fear may never completely disappear, I know I can overcome it and move forward. The kindly old lady. As a college student on a tight budget, finding affordable housing was a challenge. When I came across an ad for a room for rent in a quaint old house near campus, it seemed too good to be true. The rent was cheap, and the landlady, Mrs. Whitaker, was a sweet, elderly woman who reminded me of my grandmother. From the moment I moved in, Mrs. Whitaker treated me like family. She cooked meals for me, offered to do my laundry, and always had a warm smile and a kind word. The house itself was charming, filled with antique furniture and cozy knickknacks. I felt lucky to have found such a perfect place. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice odd things. Mrs. Whitaker had a habit of talking to herself, which I initially chalked up to her age. But her conversations were more than just idle chatter. They were intense, almost like arguments, with pauses where it seemed she was listening to someone else. One night, as I was heading to bed, I heard her speaking in a low, urgent tone. I crept closer to her room, curious about what she was saying. I know, she whispered. But he's a good boy. He doesn't need to know yet. A chill ran down my spine. Who was she talking to? And what didn't I need to know? I retreated to my room, unease settling over me. The next day, I decided to do some snooping. While Mrs. Whitaker was out shopping, I explored the house, looking for clues. In the basement, I found a locked door. My curiosity piqued. I searched for the key, eventually finding it hidden in a jar on a high shelf. The door creaked open, revealing a room filled with old photographs and personal belongings. But what caught my eye was an altar in the center of the room, adorned with candles, flowers, and framed pictures. I approached it, my heart pounding. The pictures were of young men, all around my age. Beneath each photo was a small, handwritten note. Tommy, 1972, taken too soon. Daniel, 1984, always in my heart. The list went on, each note more unsettling than the last. As I examined the altar, I heard the front door open. Panic set in, and I quickly locked the basement door and returned the key to its hiding place. I hurried back to my room, my mind racing. What was Mrs. Whitaker hiding, and who were those men? That night, I had trouble sleeping. My dreams were filled with images of the altar and the photographs. When I finally drifted off, it was only to be awakened by the sound of footsteps outside my door. I lay still, my heart racing, as the footsteps paused, then moved on. The next morning, I confronted Mrs. Whitaker. "I found the room in the basement," I said, my voice trembling. "Who are those men?" Her expression darkened, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But then her face softened, and she sighed. "They were my tenants," she said quietly. "All of them. They were like family to me." "Then why the altar?" I asked. "Why the secrecy?" Her eyes grew distant. "I lost them all," she said. "One by one. Accidents, illnesses, they all left me. The altar is my way of keeping their memory alive." Her explanation was plausible, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The intensity of her conversations, the way she spoke to herself, it all pointed to something more sinister. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to dig deeper. Over the next few days, I kept a close watch on Mrs. Whitaker, noting her behavior and the patterns of her conversations. She continued to talk to herself, but now I noticed other oddities. She would disappear for hours, and when she returned, she seemed different, more tired, more irritable. I began to search the house for more clues. One evening, while Mrs. Whitaker was out, I found a hidden compartment in her bedroom closet. Inside was a journal filled with entries dating back decades. As I read through it, a horrifying picture emerged. The journal detailed the lives of her tenants, each entry becoming more disturbing as time went on. She wrote about her attachment to them, how they filled the void left by her husband's death. But the entries grew darker, describing strange rituals and sacrifices. One entry in particular caught my eye. March 3rd, 1996. "Stephen has been so kind, so helpful, but he's been asking questions. I can't let him leave. The ritual must be performed. He will be with me forever." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just about keeping their memory alive. She believed she was trapping their spirits, binding them to her through some twisted ritual. I realized with growing horror that I was next. I needed to get out, but I couldn't just leave. I had to expose her to make sure no one else fell victim to her madness. I took photos of the journal entries and the altar, compiling as much evidence as I could. That night, I packed a bag, ready to leave at a moment's notice. But as I lay in bed, my mind racing, I heard her voice outside my door again. "He knows," she whispered. "We have to act quickly." I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding. I grabbed my bag and quietly opened the window, preparing to climb out. But as I did, the door burst open, and Mrs. Whitaker stood there, her eyes wild with fury. "Where do you think you're going?" she hissed, advancing towards me. I backed away, my mind racing. "I'm leaving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know what you've done, and I'm going to the police." She laughed, a cold, menacing sound. "You think anyone will believe you? An old woman, performing rituals? They'll think you're crazy." I had no choice. I had to escape. I turned and climbed out the window, dropping to the ground below. I heard her shouting after me, but I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the police station. Bursting through the doors, I demanded to see an officer. I showed them the photos and explained everything. They were skeptical at first, but the evidence was compelling enough for them to investigate. The next day, they raided Mrs. Whitaker's house. They found the altar, the journal, and enough evidence to arrest her. She was charged with multiple counts of murder and unlawful imprisonment. The community was in shock, unable to reconcile the kindly old woman they knew with the monster she had become. As the investigation unfolded, more details came to light. Mrs. Whitaker had indeed been performing rituals, using dark magic to bind the spirits of her tenants to her. The journal entries were verified, and the remains of several of her previous tenants were found buried in the backyard. The trial was a media sensation, with people flocking to hear the sordid details of her crimes. She maintained her innocence, claiming that she was only trying to protect her tenants and keep them close. But the evidence was overwhelming, and she was found guilty on all counts. Despite her conviction, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The house was sold, and I moved to a new apartment, trying to put the whole ordeal behind me. But the memories lingered, haunting my dreams and making me question the safety of my new home. One night, as I was settling into bed, I heard a familiar sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. My heart raced, and I froze, listening intently. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning the room. There, in the corner, was a small, antique mirror. I'd found it at a flea market and thought it would add a touch of charm to my new place. But now, it seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. I approached it cautiously, my breath shallow. The tapping continued, and as I looked into the mirror, I saw a shadowy figure standing behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, its face twisted in a silent scream. I recognized it. It was one of Mrs. Whitaker's victims. The mirror began to ripple, and the tapping grew louder, almost deafening. I knew I had to act. I grabbed the mirror and threw it to the ground, shattering it into pieces. The tapping stopped, and the room fell silent. I collapsed onto the floor, my heart racing, as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The next day, I called a psychic to cleanse my apartment. She performed a ritual, assuring me that the spirits were now at peace. But I knew that I would never be free from the shadows of my past. The experience had changed me, making me hyper-aware of the unseen forces that lurked in the corners of our world. I continued my studies, but I also began to delve into the paranormal, seeking to understand the dark magic that Mrs. Whitaker had practiced. In the years that followed, I became a paranormal investigator, helping others who found themselves entangled in the supernatural. Each case brought its own challenges, but I approached them with a newfound sense of purpose and determination. And so, my life took a different path, shaped by the horrors I had faced. I remained vigilant, always aware that the line between the mundane and the supernatural was thinner than most people realized. And I vowed to never forget the lessons I had learned from the kindly old lady who had hidden such dark secrets behind her sweet smile. The Missing Tenant. When I moved into my new apartment, I was eager for a fresh start. The building was old, but charming, with creaky wooden floors and a view of the city skyline. My neighbor, Mr. Davis, lived next door, but I never saw him. His apartment door was always closed, and there was an eerie silence that seemed to emanate from within. The first few weeks were uneventful. I settled into my routine, unpacking boxes and exploring the neighborhood. But it wasn't long before I noticed something odd. Mr. Davis's mail was piling up, and there was no sign of life from his apartment. I asked the building manager about him, and she shrugged. "Mr. Davis? Haven't seen him in a while. Quiet guy, keeps to himself." Her nonchalance struck me as strange. How could someone go unnoticed for so long? My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. One evening, I knocked on his door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Determined, I jiggled the handle. To my surprise, it turned, and the door creaked open. I hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was watching, before stepping inside. The apartment was dark and musty, with a palpable sense of abandonment. Dust coated the furniture, and cobwebs hung from the corners. "Mr. Davis?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. There was no response. I ventured further in, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The living room was sparsely furnished, and the kitchen looked like it hadn't been used in months. As I approached the bedroom, I noticed a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. My heart pounded as I pushed open the bedroom door. The room was empty, but the tapping continued, coming from the closet. I approached cautiously, my breath shallow. With a trembling hand, I flung open the closet door. Inside was a small, old-fashioned radio, its dial spinning on its own, emitting static and that persistent tapping sound. I turned it off, and the silence that followed was deafening. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I'd found, I noticed something else, an envelope taped to the back wall of the closet. I peeled it off and opened it, revealing a letter written in shaky handwriting. "Help me. He's watching." A chill ran down my spine. Who was watching, and where was Mr. Davis? I pocketed the letter and quickly left the apartment, locking the door behind me. Back in my own apartment, I examined the letter more closely. The handwriting was frantic, and the words seemed to blur together in some places. It was clear that Mr. Davis had been terrified. I decided to do some digging. Online searches revealed little about Mr. Davis, but I did find a few articles about strange occurrences in the building, residents reporting eerie noises, objects moving on their own, and glimpses of shadowy figures. It seemed my new home had a dark history. Over the next few days, the strange events began to escalate. I heard footsteps in the hallway late at night, but when I checked, no one was there. My lights flickered, and I felt a constant sense of being watched. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I reached out to other tenants in the building. Most were reluctant to talk, brushing off my questions with nervous smiles. But one old woman, Mrs. Jensen, was more forthcoming. "Mr. Davis wasn't the first to go missing," she told me in a hushed tone. "Over the years, several tenants have disappeared without a trace. Always the ones living in that apartment." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" She glanced around, as if afraid of being overheard. "There's something wrong with that apartment. It's like it's alive." I've heard things, seen things. Shadows moving when there shouldn't be any. Voices whispering at night. My skepticism was waning, replaced by a growing sense of dread. I thanked Mrs. Jensen and returned to my apartment, my mind racing. If what she said was true, then Mr. Davis was in serious trouble, if he was even still alive. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the old building. Around midnight, I heard it again, the soft, rhythmic tapping coming from Mr. Davis's apartment. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured into the hallway. The sound grew louder as I approached his door. My hands trembled as I unlocked it and stepped inside. The apartment was as dark and silent as before, but the tapping persisted. It was coming from the bedroom again. I made my way there, my heart pounding in my chest. The closet door was ajar, and the tapping seemed to be coming from within. As I approached, a sense of foreboding washed over me. I swung the closet door open, expecting to find the radio again, but it was gone. Instead, there was a hole in the back wall, just large enough for someone to crawl through. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but my curiosity and my concern for Mr. Davis propelled me forward. I squeezed through the hole, emerging into a narrow, dimly lit passageway. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. I followed the passage, the tapping sound growing louder with each step. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a small, hidden room. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in grime. The tapping was louder now, coming from behind the mirror. I reached out and wiped away some of the grime, revealing a figure on the other side. It was Mr. Davis. His eyes were wide with fear, and he was tapping on the glass, trying to get my attention. I stared in horror, realizing he was trapped on the other side, in some kind of twisted reflection. "Help me," he mouthed, his voice muffled by the glass. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to find a solution. But before I could act, the mirror's surface began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. Mr. Davis's expression turned to one of terror, and he was pulled away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the glass. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The mirror went still, its surface once again reflecting the empty room. I knew I had to get out of there, to find someone who could help. But as I turned to leave, I heard a voice, a soft, whispering voice, coming from the mirror. "You're next." Panic surged through me as I fled the hidden room, the whispering voice echoing in my mind. I crawled back through the hole in the closet, desperate to escape the nightmare I had stumbled into. Back in Mr. Davis's apartment, I slammed the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. I needed help, but who could I turn to? The police would think I was crazy if I told them about mirrors and hidden rooms. And even if they believed me, what could they do against something so supernatural? I decided to reach out to the reporter who had helped me before. I sent him an urgent email explaining everything I had discovered. I didn't expect a quick response, but to my surprise, he replied almost immediately. "I'm on my way," his message read. "Stay put and don't go back in there." I followed his advice, locking myself in my apartment and waiting anxiously for his arrival. Every creak and shadow outside my window set my nerves on edge, and I kept glancing at the clock, counting the minutes. Finally, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find the reporter standing there, looking grim but determined. "Show me," he said. I led him to Mr. Davis's apartment, and we ventured inside together. I showed him the hidden passage and the mirror room, my fear palpable as we approached the cursed glass. The reporter examined the mirror, his expression unreadable. "This is incredible," he murmured, "but also very dangerous." "What do we do?" I asked, my voice shaking. He turned to me, his eyes serious. "We need to destroy it. Whatever this mirror is, it's a conduit, a gateway to something evil. If we break it, we might be able to free Mr. Davis and stop whatever force is behind this." I nodded, my fear mingled with a sense of hope. We returned to my apartment to gather supplies, tools, ropes, anything we might need. Armed with a sledgehammer, we headed back to the hidden room. The mirror seemed to hum with malevolent energy as we approached, the air growing colder. The reporter handed me the sledgehammer, his expression resolute. "Do it," he said. "Quickly." I raised the hammer, my hands trembling. With all my strength, I brought it down on the mirror's surface. The glass shattered, fragments flying in all directions. A deafening roar filled the room, and the ground trembled beneath our feet. As the mirror broke, a dark, swirling vortex appeared, pulling at everything in the room. I clung to the reporter, both of us struggling to stay grounded. Through the chaos, I glimpsed Mr. Davis, his figure emerging from the vortex, his face a mix of relief and terror. The vortex began to collapse in on itself, the roar intensifying. We were thrown back as a final blinding flash of light filled the room. Then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the mirror was gone, replaced by an empty frame. The air was still, and the sense of malevolence had vanished. Mr. Davis lay on the floor, unconscious but alive. The reporter and I rushed to his side, helping him up. "We did it," I whispered, a sense of disbelief washing over me. "We actually did it." Mr. Davis slowly regained consciousness, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I thought I'd never escape." We helped him back to my apartment, where we called for medical assistance. The paramedics arrived and took Mr. Davis to the hospital, assuring us he would recover. The reporter and I stayed behind, our minds reeling from the night's events. We sat in silence, processing everything that had happened. Finally, he spoke. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. I'll write the story, expose the truth about this place. People need to know." I nodded, grateful for his help. As he left, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The nightmare was over, and Mr. Davis was safe. But I knew I would never forget what I had seen, the horrors lurking just beyond the surface of our reality. Life slowly returned to normal, but I remained vigilant, always wary of the shadows. The building felt different, lighter, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. But I knew that the true danger lay in the unknown, in the mysteries that still lurked in the corners of our world. And so, I continued my life with a newfound appreciation for the mundane, always aware that the line between reality and nightmare was thinner than I had ever imagined. The mystery of the house next door. Moving to a new house was supposed to be a fresh start for us. My wife, Lisa, and our 2 kids, Emma and Jake, were excited about the change. The house was perfect, situated in a quiet neighborhood with a big yard for the kids to play in. The only oddity was the house next door, old, abandoned, and shrouded in mystery. The neighbors told us that the house had been vacant for years. Its last occupants had vanished without a trace, leaving everything behind. The local kids made up ghost stories about it, claiming to see lights flickering in the windows at night. We laughed it off, attributing it to overactive imaginations. The first few weeks in our new home were blissful. The kids loved their new rooms, and Lisa and I enjoyed the peace and quiet. But then, strange things began to happen. It started with the lights. Late at night, we'd see a faint glow coming from the windows of the abandoned house. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but it became more frequent. One night, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed next door, my curiosity piqued. The house was even creepier up close. The windows were dirty and cracked, and the front door was slightly ajar. I hesitated before stepping inside, the air thick with dust and decay. The interior was a time capsule, frozen in the moment its occupants had left. Furniture covered in sheets, toys scattered on the floor, and a calendar on the wall from 5 years ago. As I moved through the house, the faint glow drew me to the basement. The door was slightly open, and I could hear a low hum emanating from below. My heart pounded as I descended the stairs, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The basement was filled with old, forgotten belongings. In the center of the room was a large antique mirror, its surface covered in grime. The glow was coming from behind it. I reached out to touch the mirror, but before I could, I heard a voice, a soft, childlike whisper. "Help us." I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from the mirror itself. I backed away, my mind racing. What was this place? Who were these voices? I returned home, shaken but determined to find answers. I told Lisa what I had experienced, but she was skeptical. "Maybe it's just your imagination," she suggested. "That house gives everyone the creeps." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next day, I went to the local library and dug into the house's history. What I found was chilling. The previous owners, the Thompsons, had disappeared without a trace. They had 2 children, both of whom were never found. Rumors of hauntings and strange occurrences had plagued the house ever since. I showed Lisa the articles I found, and she started to share my concern. We decided to keep a closer watch on the house, not wanting to alarm the kids unnecessarily. A week later, our worst fears were realized. It was a Saturday, and the kids were playing in the yard. Lisa and I were inside when we heard Emma scream. We rushed outside, but she was nowhere to be found. Jake was crying, pointing towards the abandoned house. "Emma went inside," he sobbed. "She said she saw a little girl waving at her." Panic set in, and we raced next door. The front door was wide open, and we called out for Emma, our voices echoing through the empty rooms. There was no response. We split up to search the house, my heart pounding with every step. I made my way to the basement, the glow from the mirror still there. I called out her name, but there was only silence. Then I heard the whisper again. "Help us." I approached the mirror, my reflection staring back at me. But this time, there was something else. Behind me, in the mirror's reflection, was Emma, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She was trying to say something, but no sound came out. I turned around, but she wasn't there. Panic gripped me as I realized she was trapped in the mirror, just like the voices I had heard before. I pounded on the glass, desperate to reach her. "Emma, hold on, I'm going to get you out." I frantically searched the basement for anything that might help free Emma. The mirror seemed to hum with a sinister energy, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I found an old book on a dusty shelf, its pages filled with strange symbols and incantations. Desperation drove me to flip through it, hoping for a clue. Lisa's voice echoed down the stairs, her panic evident. "Did you find her?" "She's in the mirror," I shouted back. "I'm trying to figure out how to get her out." Lisa joined me, her eyes wide with terror as she saw Emma's reflection. "Oh my God, we have to do something." I showed her the book, and we pored over its pages together. One passage stood out, a ritual to break the connection between the physical world and the mirror realm. It required specific items, a candle, salt, and a piece of the person trapped inside. "We need something of Emma's," I said, my mind racing. "Did she have anything with her?" Lisa thought for a moment, then ran upstairs to Emma's room. She returned with a small stuffed bear, Emma's favorite toy. "This should work," she said, her voice trembling. We followed the instructions in the book, setting up the ritual as described. The candle flickered as we lit it, casting eerie shadows on the walls. We sprinkled the salt in a circle around the mirror, then placed the stuffed bear in the center. Holding hands, we began to chant the incantation, our voices shaky but determined. The mirror's surface began to ripple, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The candle's flame flickered wildly, but we kept going, our eyes fixed on Emma's reflection. As we reached the final words of the incantation, the mirror's surface shuddered violently. There was a blinding flash of light, and we were thrown back, the book flying from my hands. When the light faded, the room was silent. The mirror was cracked, its surface dull and lifeless. I scrambled to my feet and rushed to it, my heart pounding. "Emma? Emma, are you there?" For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a soft voice responded. "Daddy?" I turned around to see Emma standing in the center of the salt circle, her eyes wide with confusion but unharmed. I rushed to her, scooping her up in my arms, tears of relief streaming down my face. Lisa joined us, hugging Emma tightly. "Thank God you're okay," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. We left the abandoned house, vowing never to return. The events of that night haunted us, but we were grateful to have Emma back. The house was eventually torn down, the land left vacant, a silent reminder of the darkness that had once lurked there. Life slowly returned to normal, though the experience left its mark on all of us. Emma had no memory of what had happened, for which we were grateful. We never spoke of the mirror or the voices again, but the sense of unease lingered, a constant reminder of the horrors we had faced. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of the mystery. The mirror was gone, but the darkness remained, hidden in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity. And so, we lived with a newfound awareness of the unseen forces that lurked in the corners of our world, always vigilant, always wary, knowing that some doors should never be opened and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The window across the street. Living alone in a small apartment, I often found myself gazing out the window, seeking a connection to the world outside. My favorite pastime was watching the comings and goings of my neighbors, particularly the man who lived directly across the street. He was tall, with a stern face and an air of mystery that intrigued me. Every night, without fail, he would stand at his window, staring out into the darkness. At first, I thought he was just a night owl, but as the weeks passed, I noticed a pattern. He always appeared at the same time, 10 p.m. sharp, and stood there for exactly 1 hour. It was as if he were waiting for something, or someone. One night, unable to resist my curiosity, I decided to stay up and watch him. As the clock struck 10, he appeared, his silhouette stark against the dim light of his apartment. He stood motionless, his eyes seemingly fixed on my window. A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my binoculars, a relic from my birdwatching phase, and focused on his window. What I saw made my heart race. He wasn't just standing there. He was reenacting something. His movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. He held an object in his hand, mimicking a stabbing motion. Then he paused, his gaze piercing through the glass, directly at me. I dropped the binoculars, my hands shaking. Had he seen me? I quickly turned off my lights and retreated to the safety of my bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child hiding from the boogeyman. The next morning, I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was rehearsing for a play or something. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to investigate further. Days turned into weeks, and I kept a meticulous log of his activities. Each night, the same routine. It was like watching a horror movie on repeat. I noticed details I had missed before. The red stains on his shirt, the eerie smile on his face as he mimicked the stabbing motion. It was unsettling, to say the least. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I left my apartment and made my way across the street, my heart pounding with each step. His building was old, with creaky floors and dimly lit hallways. I found his apartment easily enough and pressed my ear to the door. Silence. Gathering my courage, I knocked. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, empty apartment. I stepped inside, my heart in my throat. The place was sparsely furnished, with an air of neglect. In the living room, I found the window he always stood at. The view was eerily similar to mine, a mirror image of my own apartment. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A notebook on the coffee table. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. My blood ran cold. It was a detailed journal, filled with notes about me, my name, my habits, even my favorite foods. He had been watching me just as I had been watching him. Before I could process this horrifying revelation, I heard footsteps. Panic set in, and I quickly hid behind the couch. The footsteps grew louder, and soon he was standing in the doorway, his back to me. He moved to the window, resuming his nightly ritual, completely unaware of my presence. I watched, frozen in place, as he went through his usual motions. The red stains on his shirt, the sinister smile. It all made sense now. He was recreating the murders he had committed, using me as his unwitting audience. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan to escape without being noticed. As he turned away from the window, I seized the moment. I crept towards the door, my movements slow and deliberate. Just as I reached the handle, he spoke. "You should have stayed in your apartment." His voice was calm, almost amused. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. He stood there, a knife in his hand, his eyes cold and devoid of emotion. "What do you want from me?" I stammered, backing away. He tilted his head, regarding me with a chilling curiosity. "You've been watching me, haven't you? Did you enjoy the show?" I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I don't know what you're talking about." He laughed, a low, sinister sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Don't lie to me. I've seen you with your binoculars. You're just as guilty as I am." Desperation surged through me. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. I'll leave, and I won't say a word to anyone." He took a step closer, the knife glinting in the dim light. "It's too late for that. You're part of this now." I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I burst out of the apartment and raced down the hallway, not daring to look back. My mind was a blur of fear and adrenaline as I fled the building and made my way back to my apartment. Once inside, I locked the door and collapsed against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to do something, call the police, get help, anything. But as I reached for the phone, a realization hit me. He knew where I lived. He had been watching me for weeks. If I went to the police, he would come after me. And who would believe my story? A lonely woman spying on her neighbor, imagining things. Days passed in a haze of fear and paranoia. I barely left my apartment, keeping the lights off and the curtains drawn. Every creak and rustle made me jump, my mind conjuring images of him lurking outside, waiting for the right moment to strike. I knew I couldn't live like this forever. I had to take action, to find a way to expose him without putting myself in further danger. I spent hours online researching the recent murders in the area, looking for anything that might connect him to the crimes. My breakthrough came when I found an old news article about a string of unsolved murders. The victims all lived in the same neighborhood, and each was killed in their home. The descriptions of the killer's methods matched what I had seen him reenacting in his window. It was him, no doubt about it. Armed with this information, I contacted a local reporter known for his investigative work. I explained my situation, leaving out my own voyeuristic tendencies, and provided the evidence I had gathered. He agreed to look into it, promising to keep me informed. The waiting was excruciating. Every night I watched him from my darkened apartment, praying that the reporter would find something concrete. Then one evening, my phone buzzed with a message. It was the reporter. "Meet me tomorrow at noon. I have something." The next day, I ventured out for the first time in weeks, my heart heavy with anticipation and fear. I met the reporter at a small cafe, and he wasted no time getting to the point. "You were right," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "Your neighbor is the prime suspect in a series of murders. The police have been looking for him for months." I glanced through the documents, my hands trembling. It was all there: photos, witness statements, forensic evidence. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to go to the police with this," he replied. "But we have to be careful. If he finds out we're onto him, it could be dangerous." That night, the reporter and I went to the police station, handing over the evidence. The officers took our statements and assured us they would act swiftly. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The following evening, I watched from my window as unmarked police cars surrounded my neighbor's building. Officers moved in, their silhouettes barely visible in the darkness. Minutes later, they emerged with him in handcuffs. His expression was one of cold indifference, but when he glanced in my direction, our eyes met. His look was one of quiet menace, promising retribution. In the days that followed, the police uncovered more evidence linking him to the murders. The community was in shock, but I felt a sense of relief knowing he was behind bars. The nightmare was over, or so I thought. A week later, I received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a single photograph, me, taken from his window, with a message scrawled on the back. "I'm always watching." Fear gripped me once more. He might be in prison, but his influence lingered. My life had been irrevocably changed by the man in the window across the street. I knew I could never let my guard down, never assume I was safe. I installed new locks, security cameras, and even moved to a new apartment. But every night, as I stood by my window, I couldn't help but look across the street, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. The fear was always there, lurking in the shadows, a constant reminder of the danger that once loomed so close. And so, I live my life in perpetual vigilance, knowing that some nightmares never truly end. They just fade into the background, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Well, my fear seekers, we've reached the end of another bone-chilling journey. I hope these tales of creepy neighbors and sinister secrets have kept you on the edge of your seat. Remember, the next time you wave to your neighbor, you might want to think twice about what could be hiding behind those curtains. Until next time, sleep with one eye open and always keep your doors locked. This is Fearmaster, signing off. Sweet nightmares, everyone. Sweet nightmares.